There comes a time when life starts to feel different. It's not always about a number or a birthday. Sometimes it's a quiet shift. You wake up one morning, and the things that once seemed urgent now seem less important. The outer world starts to fade just a little, and something inside begins to whisper. Carl Jung called this the turning point, the beginning of the second half of life. He believed that this stage isn't about decline, it's about deepening. It's when the soul begins to speak more clearly, and the search for meaning becomes more personal, more inward. If you're wondering whether you're entering this chapter, here are 7 gentle signs, inspired by Jung, that the second half of life has already begun. Sign 1. You begin to question what used to feel certain. There often comes a quiet moment in a person's life, usually later, past the age of 60, when something begins to feel unfamiliar. Not necessarily on the outside, the home is the same. The routines may still follow their rhythm, but inside, a gentle restlessness stirs. Things that once seemed obvious and unquestioned begin to feel uncertain. Long-held beliefs, values, priorities, even one's sense of self, all start to shift. There is no drama to it, no sudden collapse. Instead, it's like standing in a familiar room and realizing that the furniture has somehow been rearranged. What used to make sense now requires a second look. This is often the first quiet sign that a person has begun to enter the second half of life. Carl Jung saw this not as a crisis, but as a transition, one that invites introspection rather than achievement, questioning rather than knowing. During the first half of life, much energy is spent building a career, a family, a reputation, a set of beliefs that help navigate the world. Certainty is not just useful, it feels necessary. It offers a sense of control, identity, and purpose. But as the decades pass, those same certainties can begin to feel restrictive. They may no longer fit the deeper questions that are starting to arise. One might begin to question why certain goals were ever important. Success, status, or social roles that once felt essential now feel hollow. There is no shame in this realization. It is not a rejection of the past, but a deepening of awareness. The things that drove a person through much of life may have served their purpose well, but they are no longer enough. The soul asks for more than accomplishment. It asks for meaning. It asks for truth that resonates from within, not just rules accepted from without. This shift can be disorienting. A person might find themselves unsure of what they really believe. Values passed down from family or community may no longer feel aligned with lived experience. Ideas about success, failure, love, faith, or self-worth may start to unravel. And yet, this unraveling is not destruction. It is a soft clearing, a making of space for something more honest to take root. What is lost in certainty is gained in clarity. This questioning often brings with it a mixture of emotions. There can be grief for what was once trusted. There can be guilt for letting go of long-held ideals. There can be fear of not knowing what comes next. But alongside these emotions, there is also relief, a quiet liberation. To question is to move beyond autopilot. It is to step into a life that is more intentional, more reflective, more alive. As Jung understood, this shift is not a step backward. It is not a sign of weakness or confusion. It is a sign of growth, of maturity, of the psyche preparing for a different kind of work, the inner work of becoming whole. The first half of life asks, how do I fit into the world? The second half asks, what is the world within me? And with that question comes the freedom to see things anew. Many people begin to feel drawn to books, ideas, or conversations that they once ignored. They seek different voices. They notice different aspects of themselves, parts that had been buried under responsibility or fear. Creativity that was once dismissed now beckons quietly. A desire for simplicity, stillness, or solitude may rise, challenging old assumptions about what a meaningful life looks like. This inward turning does not reject the world, but it repositions the self within it. External validation loses its power. Comparison fades. A person no longer needs to explain their choices as much as they once did. Instead, they ask, what feels right to me now? What truth am I ready to hear? What part of myself have I not yet fully met? This kind of questioning is not always easy. It may cause tension in relationships, discomfort in long-standing routines, or a sense of unfamiliarity with one's own identity. But it is also the doorway to a more honest life, a life guided not by habit or fear, but by insight and authenticity. Those who allow this questioning to unfold slowly begin to notice its gifts. They feel more present. They respond more than they react. They stop needing to have all the answers and start becoming more comfortable with mystery. They let go of rigid expectations and find joy in simple truths. They begin to see themselves not as a finished product, but as a living process, still unfolding, still becoming. In this space of gentle questioning, something sacred begins to grow, a sense of peace that is no longer tied to certainty, a trust that does not depend on control, a wisdom that comes not from knowing more, but from being more fully awake to what is. And so the beginning of the second half of life is marked not by answers but by questions, not by knowing but by listening, not by arrival but by turning inward and saying, softly, honestly, for the first time in a long time, maybe there is more to me than I ever allowed myself to see. Maybe it is time to find out who I truly am. Sign 2. Your values start to shift from success to meaning. As the decades unfold and a person reaches their 60s or 70s, the nature of inner motivation begins to change in subtle but profound ways. What once served as a powerful source of energy, ambition, competition, progress, now often gives way to something quieter, deeper, and more personal. The pursuit of success, which shaped so much of earlier life, gradually loses its grip, not because it was wrong, but because it begins to feel less relevant. In its place, a longing for meaning starts to take root. Carl Jung observed this shift as a natural phase in the individuation process, where the psyche moves from external goals to internal wholeness. This transition is not abrupt. It unfolds gradually, often unnoticed at first, until one day the person who used to strive for outcomes wakes up and wonders why those outcomes no longer matter as much. Success, as it is typically defined, often revolves around measurement, titles, achievements, recognition, productivity, results. These metrics are useful in the first half of life when the task is to establish a place in the world. They provide direction, validation, and a sense of security. But as a person enters the second half of life, these same markers can start to feel empty. The applause fades, or perhaps it never came in the way one expected. The trophies begin to gather dust. What once felt vital begins to feel performative. The self asks a new question: what is all of this for? This question signals the emergence of deeper values. Rather than being driven by achievement, a person becomes more interested in authenticity. Rather than chasing recognition, they seek resonance. They care less about what looks good and more about what feels true. The shift from success to meaning is not about giving up or withdrawing. It is about reorienting. It is the soul's quiet realignment with its own nature. In this phase, people often begin to make different choices. They might step away from roles that no longer fit, not because they are tired, but because they are no longer willing to live in ways that feel hollow. They might start to prioritize relationships, creativity, nature, or inner reflection. They begin to see time not as something to be filled, but as something to be honored. They want their days to be meaningful, not merely productive. Jung believed that this shift is part of the psyche's evolution. The first half of life builds the container. The second half fills it with soul. When people allow this transition to occur, they often experience an unexpected sense of peace. They are no longer trying to prove anything. They are simply trying to live in a way that aligns with who they are becoming. Meaning is not found in big declarations. It is found in small, deliberate acts of presence. A walk at dawn, a handwritten letter, a meal cooked slowly, a conversation without agenda. These moments may not be impressive, but they feel full. They nourish. They bring a sense of quiet fulfillment that no title ever could. There is often grief in this transition. Letting go of old ambitions can feel like a loss of identity. A person may wonder who they are without the chase, the goals, the external affirmation. But this grief is a doorway. It makes space for something more enduring to emerge, a self that is not tied to performance, but to presence. This new value system often includes service, not in the grand sense, but in the everyday kind. People begin to find meaning in giving, in listening, in sharing their story. They want to contribute in ways that matter, not just succeed in ways that impress. The ego no longer needs to be fed. The soul wants to offer something honest. A person who once found purpose in being busy might now find it in being still. One who defined themselves by productivity may now find joy in attention to beauty, to others, to their own breath. The internal shift reshapes the way life is experienced. Time slows, depth increases. Life no longer feels like a race, but like a river, something to be met, felt, and trusted. This change in values also affects how one sees others. The need to compare begins to fade. The judgment that came with competition starts to soften. There is more room for empathy, for difference, for the imperfect reality of being human. Success becomes less about climbing and more about arriving into presence, into authenticity, into connection. The beauty of this shift is that it does not depend on external change. It can happen quietly, within a person who still goes to work, still meets obligations, still fulfills roles. What changes is not the outer shape of life, but the inner posture. There is less striving, more receiving, less proving, more being, less control, more trust. Carl Jung saw this inner reorientation as essential to psychological health in later life. Without it, the soul begins to dry out. The person may look successful on the outside, but feel lost on the inside. But with it, something ancient is remembered. The person reconnects with their essence, not their role, not their reputation, but the part of them that has always known how to feel, how to love, how to simply be. This shift is not always easy, but it is deeply rewarding. It does not erase the first half of life, but it adds depth to it. It is a return, not to the past, but to the self, a self that is no longer built from expectation, but from truth. And in that truth lies meaning, the kind that lasts, the kind that heals, the kind that feels like home. Sign 3. You feel less drawn to roles and more to your real self. As the years unfold and life enters its quieter chapters, many people begin to notice a gentle shift inside them. It is not always loud or sudden. It does not announce itself with fireworks or milestones. Instead, it comes softly, often as a kind of inner questioning, a quiet longing, or a subtle discomfort with things that once felt normal. A person may find themselves waking up and feeling disconnected from the roles they have spent a lifetime performing. These roles, once embraced with energy or necessity, mother, provider, manager, caretaker, fixer, partner, begin to feel more like costumes than reflections of something essential. This realization does not always come with regret. More often it arrives with a tender sense of curiosity. Who am I really when no one needs me to be anything? Carl Jung wrote deeply about the process of individuation, the inner journey toward becoming one's true self. This journey often begins in earnest in the second half of life, not because the earlier years were wrong or wasted, but because they were focused outward, on survival, building, responsibility, and fitting in. These outer roles serve a purpose. They help establish identity and social belonging. They allow families to be raised, careers to be built, communities to be supported. But the self that performs those roles is often shaped more by expectation than authenticity. When those external structures begin to loosen, as they often do with age, the soul sees an opening. And into that space comes the desire for something more real. This shift is rarely dramatic. There is no need to abandon the world or withdraw from others. What changes is the inner orientation. A person begins to care less about who they are supposed to be and more about who they actually are. The opinions of others lose their edge. Social masks begin to fall away. There is a growing desire to live in a way that feels true, even if it is quieter, even if it looks smaller on the outside. For someone who has spent their life in service to others, perhaps raising children or managing a household, this shift can feel like coming home. They begin to realize that their worth is not tied to what they do for others, but to who they are in their own heart. For someone who built a career based on ambition and structure, there may be a quiet letting go of professional identity. They may still work, still contribute, but the attachment to the title fades. In its place grows a desire for alignment, for ease, for presence. This process often involves loss, not of self but of illusion. The illusion that being needed is the same as being loved. The illusion that success equals fulfillment. The illusion that control guarantees peace. As these fall away, the person is left not with emptiness, but with space. And in that space, something real can grow. The real self does not need to be impressive. It does not need applause or explanation. It needs time, attention, and gentleness. It may have been hidden for years beneath layers of responsibility or fear. It may have been waiting quietly, like a seed beneath the soil. When the outer roles begin to soften, that seed begins to sprout. It might show up in unexpected ways: a renewed interest in art, a desire for silence, a pull towards spiritual questions, a longing for simplicity. These are not signs of regression, they are signs of return. Jung believed that the task of the second half of life is to integrate the self, not to become someone else, but to become more fully who we've always been. This involves accepting all parts of ourselves, even the ones we were taught to hide or dismiss. The person who was always strong may begin to explore their tenderness. The one who was always responsible may begin to explore freedom. The one who was always pleasing may begin to explore honesty. In many ways, this is a shedding, not a loss, but a revealing. The person removes the heavy coat of identity they were given or chose, and underneath it finds their skin, their breath, their quiet truth. This truth is not loud, it does not need to be, it simply is. And the more it is honored, the more life begins to feel aligned. This journey is not always easy. The world often rewards roles more than authenticity. There may be moments of doubt, of wondering whether it is selfish to step back from old responsibilities, whether it is foolish to change paths later in life. But the deeper self knows. It has waited patiently through all the seasons of becoming what others needed, and now it whispers, "Become what you need. Become what you are." There is a great peace in this, to no longer perform, to no longer explain, to simply be, not as a concept, not as a reaction, but as a living, breathing truth. This is the gift of aging, not decline, but revelation, not limitation, but liberation. As the outer world quiets, the inner world comes alive. And in that world lives the self, not the role, not the title, not the mask, but the soul. The one who watches, the one who feels, the one who remains. And when a person begins to live from that place, life no longer feels like a series of tasks or performances. It becomes something softer, deeper, truer, something rooted, something real. And that perhaps is the true purpose of the second half of life. Not to do more, but to be more. Not to serve a role, but to serve the self. Not out of ego, but out of wholeness. Out of love. Sign 4. You become more reflective and less reactive. As the pace of life naturally slows in the later decades, many people begin to notice a shift not just in what they do, but in how they experience the world. There is a growing spaciousness between event and response, between emotion and reaction. What once triggered a sharp reply now evokes a moment of silence. What once felt urgent now feels like something that can wait. This is not indifference. It is not passivity. It is the emergence of reflection, a deeper, quieter awareness that allows a person to see rather than simply react. In earlier life, much of behavior is driven by immediacy. The mind reacts quickly, shaped by years of habit, social conditioning, survival instincts, and emotional defenses. Someone says something that feels threatening, and a retort is ready. A problem arises, and anxiety leaps to solve it. The nervous system, so often trained in action and reaction, leads the way. But with time, and especially after 60, a different quality begins to emerge. The mind no longer leaps as quickly. The heart listens longer. There is a pause, and in that pause, there is a choice. Carl Jung saw this quality of reflection as a sign of growing psychological maturity. It is not about withdrawal from life, but about engagement with life on a deeper level. When a person becomes more reflective, they are not less alive, they are more present. Their presence is not scattered or impulsive, but rooted and clear. Reflection brings insight. It allows the person to witness their thoughts rather than be controlled by them. It allows them to hold emotions with kindness instead of being swept away. This shift often arises organically. A person may notice that they no longer need to defend themselves in every disagreement. They may hear someone's complaint and sense the pain beneath the words, rather than taking it personally. They may encounter difficulty, and instead of asking, "Why me?" they ask, "What can I learn here?" This is not a performance of wisdom. It is the natural result of having lived long enough to understand that not everything deserves a reaction, and not every reaction brings peace. As reflection deepens, a person becomes more curious about their inner world. They may begin to observe the patterns of thought that arise in certain situations. They might recognize that what seems like anger is often fear in disguise, or that what appears as impatience is actually a longing to be heard. They begin to see the layers beneath the surface, in themselves and others. This vision is soft, not harsh. It is not analysis for control, but awareness for understanding. In practical life, this shows up in countless small ways. Someone interrupts, and instead of snapping, the person breathes. A plan changes unexpectedly, and instead of spiraling into frustration, there is acceptance. A memory arises, and instead of pushing it away, they sit with it. These are not dramatic gestures, but they carry a deep significance. They signal the presence of a self that is not ruled by habit, but guided by awareness. Reflection also creates space for compassion. When a person is less reactive, they can see others more clearly. They begin to notice the pain behind criticism, the fear behind control, the longing behind anger. This does not mean excusing harmful behavior, but it does mean responding with greater humanity. Reflection softens judgment. It dissolves the illusion of separateness. It reminds the person that everyone is doing the best they can, including themselves. Jung believed that the second half of life is a time for integrating the opposites within. Reflection allows this integration to occur. It welcomes the shadow, the parts of the self that were once denied or avoided, and holds it with understanding. The reflective person is not afraid to see their own contradictions. They know that being human is not about perfection, but about honesty. And in that honesty, there is room to grow, even late in life. Becoming more reflective also alters how time is experienced. The days may pass more slowly, but they feel fuller. A conversation is not just something to get through, but something to be with. A walk is not just exercise, but a chance to notice the light, the wind, the breath. Reflection brings the present moment into sharper focus. Life becomes less about reaching the next thing and more about inhabiting what is here now. This quality of reflection does not require solitude, though it is often nurtured there. It can happen in the midst of conversation, in the act of listening, in the moment of choosing to pause instead of push. It becomes a way of being, a habit of heart. Over time, it reshapes the inner landscape. The mind becomes less noisy, the emotions less turbulent, the spirit more grounded. For those in the later stages of life, this transformation is both natural and necessary. The body may no longer move as quickly, but the soul becomes more agile. There is more wisdom in silence than in reaction. There is more freedom in letting go than in holding on. Reflection allows a person to live with greater integrity, responding to life not from fear or habit, but from truth. This does not mean that pain disappears or that challenges no longer come, but it means that when they arrive, the person is more prepared to meet them with grace. They have seen enough of life to know that all things pass. They have felt enough to trust that even sorrow can carry beauty. And they have reflected enough to know that every moment holds a choice, the choice to react blindly or respond with presence. In the end, this shift toward reflection is a return to self. It is the soul reclaiming its place as guide, the ego learning to bow, the mind learning to rest. It is not an escape from the world, but a deeper way of being in it, with eyes open, heart steady, and spirit awake. Sign 5. You notice intuition becoming stronger than logic. As the seasons of life shift and a person enters the later years, something quiet and subtle begins to emerge. It often starts without fanfare. A decision feels clearer without analysis. A dream lingers in the morning, carrying with it a feeling more real than any logic can explain. A gentle knowing arises, not from study, not from evidence, but from within. This is the voice of intuition. and it begins to speak louder than it did in earlier years. For much of life, people are trained to rely on logic. Schools reward reason. Society values evidence. Careers often depend on strategy and planning. But as the outer world quiets and the inner world expands, intuition steps forward. It is not a replacement for logic, but a deeper companion. Carl Jung understood intuition as one of the primary ways the psyche communicates its truth. He saw it as a vital function, especially in the second half of life, when the journey turns inward and the soul begins to seek what is essential rather than what is explainable. Intuition does not shout, it whispers. It is the tug that leads someone to call an old friend at just the right time. It is the discomfort that signals something isn't right, even when all signs say it should be. It is the sense of ease that arises in a moment of choice, when the heart aligns with the unseen. In younger years, this inner knowing is often drowned out by the noise of deadlines, responsibilities, and external expectations. But with age comes space, and in that space, intuition can finally be heard. This shift is not about abandoning reason, it is about rebalancing. A person begins to notice that not everything needs to be solved. Not every feeling requires a justification. Some truths are felt long before they can be proven. The mind, once the dominant navigator, begins to soften its grip. The body, the heart, the imagination all become part of the decision-making process. Intuition weaves them together into a kind of quiet clarity. For many, this change comes as a relief. It feels like coming home to something familiar, yet long ignored. It feels like remembering how to listen to oneself without needing permission. A person may begin to trust their gut when choosing how to spend their time. They may listen to dreams not as nonsense, but as messages. They may feel drawn to a path that has no clear outcome, but a deep, inner yes. This way of living is less about control and more about alignment. Intuition often deepens in solitude. In the quiet, away from distractions, the inner voice becomes clearer. It speaks in images, in symbols, in emotions that arrive without explanation. A walk in the woods might bring sudden insight. A memory from childhood might return with unexpected meaning. Jung believed that the unconscious mind is not a problem to be fixed, but a source of wisdom. Intuition is its language, and those who learn to listen are often guided in ways that logic could never predict. There is also a growing comfort with mystery. What once felt frightening, what cannot be measured or guaranteed, now feels sacred. A person may begin to live with more questions and fewer answers, and yet feel more at peace. They may recognize that the soul is not interested in certainty, but in presence. Intuition thrives in this presence. It is nourished by honesty, stillness, and trust. This intuitive turn often reshapes relationships as well. A person may feel more sensitive to the energy in a room, more attuned to unspoken truths. They may choose companionships that feel emotionally safe rather than socially expected. They may leave behind conversations that feel hollow in favor of those that nourish. Intuition guides not only decisions but also connections. In daily life, this shows up in simple but meaningful ways. Choosing to rest instead of push, saying no without needing a reason, taking a different route, reaching out to someone spontaneously, following a creative impulse. These acts may seem small, but they are signs of a deeper shift. The self is no longer living from the head alone. It is living from the whole being. There may be moments of doubt. After all, intuition rarely comes with proof. It requires trust, and trust requires experience. But as the years go on, the pattern becomes clear. When intuition is followed, there is a sense of inner peace, of rightness, even if the path is uncertain. When it is ignored, there is a lingering unease. Over time, the heart learns which voice to trust. Jung believed that in the second half of life, the unconscious begins to ask for our attention, not to confuse or overwhelm us, but to complete us. Intuition is the bridge between the conscious and unconscious, between what we think we know and what the soul already knows. Following it is not about escaping the world, but about living more truthfully within it. This is not a skill that needs to be mastered. It is a natural unfolding, a returning. The child who once followed their inner curiosity without hesitation is still there, now tempered by wisdom and deepened by experience. In later life, that inner child is welcomed back, not as something to grow out of, but as something to grow into. As intuition becomes stronger than logic, life becomes less about answers and more about attunement. It becomes a conversation between the seen and the unseen, the known and the mysterious. And in that conversation, the soul finds its voice, not loud but steady, not flashy but true. And in following that voice, a person finds not only direction but also peace. Sign 6. You feel drawn towards stillness and solitude. In the later stages of life, many people begin to feel an unfamiliar but compelling pull, not toward activity, but toward stillness, not toward crowds, but toward solitude. It is not a rejection of the world, but a quiet turning inward, as if some deeper voice within is asking to be heard. After decades spent in motion, building families, careers, reputations, and routines, a person begins to sense that something important is waiting in the spaces between obligations. The desire to fill every hour fades. The longing now is for space, not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. Carl Jung saw this movement as part of the individuation process, the soul's natural turning toward integration and inner depth in the second half of life. Stillness does not come easily in a culture that equates worth with productivity. From an early age, people are trained to be busy, to seek noise, to stay connected and occupied. Rest is often seen as laziness, solitude as loneliness, but as one matures, these assumptions begin to feel hollow. There is an inner fatigue that activity cannot fix, and from that fatigue, often, a quiet clarity begins to rise. The person begins to realize that stillness is not the absence of life, but a return to its essence. Solitude is not emptiness, but presence. Within it lives reflection, healing, and the soft unfolding of the true self. This pull towards stillness often arrives gradually. A person may start spending more time alone, not out of withdrawal, but out of choice. Mornings become slower, more contemplative. Time once spent chasing external tasks may now be given to watching light move through a room, listening to birdsong, walking without a destination. These moments begin to feel not like indulgence, but necessity. There is a sense that something sacred happens when the noise fades and the body is allowed to simply be. The mind, no longer flooded with tasks, begins to quiet. The heart, once guarded or distracted, begins to soften. Solitude allows for an encounter with the self. Not the self as shaped by others, but the self that exists beneath roles, beneath performance, beneath the constant motion of doing. In solitude, one remembers what it means to simply exist. Breathing becomes deeper, thoughts lose their urgency. Emotions, once buried or ignored, rise to the surface gently, asking to be seen. This meeting with oneself can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, but over time, it becomes a place of deep comfort, a kind of inner home that is always there, waiting to be noticed. Jung believed that the unconscious communicates most clearly in silence. Dreams, symbols, intuitions, they often arise not when we seek them directly, but when we stop seeking altogether. Stillness opens the door to this inner dialogue. It creates space for insight that cannot be accessed through logic alone. A memory may surface with new meaning. A decision may become clear without being forced. In the quiet, the psyche begins to speak in its own language. And when one learns to listen, a kind of wisdom emerges, not learned, but remembered. Solitude also reorders priorities. In the company of one's own presence, it becomes easier to discern what truly matters. The opinions of others begin to hold less weight. The desire to impress or prove diminishes. A person becomes less reactive, more grounded. They begin to choose relationships and activities that align with their values, not their ego. The constant reaching outward is replaced with a gentle settling inward. Life becomes less about acquisition and more about depth, less about noise and more about meaning. This does not mean cutting off from others. In fact, those who embrace solitude often find their connections with others becoming more authentic. When one is no longer afraid to be alone, relationships are chosen from desire, not dependence. Conversations deepen. Small talk fades. There is a new capacity to be fully present with others because one has learned to be present with oneself. Stillness can also bring up old emotions, grief, regret, unresolved sorrow. But rather than pushing them away, the person learns to sit with them, to witness them without judgment. In the quiet, healing happens. The soul is not rushed. It unfolds in its own time, and solitude becomes the sacred space in which that unfolding is allowed. There is also a spiritual dimension to stillness. Many people in later life feel a growing pull towards something beyond themselves, not necessarily in a religious sense, but in a soulful one. The mystery of existence becomes more compelling. Questions that were once avoided now feel safe to explore. Where have I been? What have I become? What is left unfinished in me? In solitude, these questions are not problems to solve, but invitations to reflect. The person no longer fears not having answers. They begin to trust that the questions themselves carry meaning. Stillness becomes not a place to visit, but a way of being. A slowing down, not just of movement, but of mind. A return to presence, to breath, to the beating of one's own heart, to the beauty of what is, without needing to change or fix it. And in that presence, the person often finds something they were missing all along, not outside, but within. A sense of enoughness, a quiet dignity, a homecoming. In the end, this draw towards stillness and solitude is not an escape from life, but a deeper entering into it. It is the soul choosing depth over speed, essence over performance. It is the recognition that in the quiet, we meet what is most real. And what is most real does not shout. It waits in silence patiently for the moment we are ready to hear. Sign 7. You start to care more about wholeness than happiness. As life moves into its later chapters, there comes a profound internal shift that is difficult to name, but unmistakable in its depth. The longing that once focused on happiness, on feeling good, on achieving contentment, on avoiding pain, begins to fade. In its place emerges a deeper, more enduring desire, the longing for wholeness. This is not about escaping sorrow or maximizing pleasure. It is about becoming complete, integrating all parts of the self, and living with a quiet truth that holds both joy and sorrow without rejecting either. For many, this shift is gradual. It happens not in a moment of revelation, but through a series of lived experiences. Disappointments that didn't destroy them, joys that were fleeting, relationships that grew or dissolved, illnesses that stripped away illusion. These events teach that life is not always pleasant, not always fair, and certainly not always controllable. And yet, through it all, there is something unshakable within, a core self that can hold everything without breaking. Carl Jung saw this as the central work of the second half of life. Happiness, he noted, is often a pursuit of the ego. It is based on conditions. If things go well, if people approve, if the body feels strong, then one is happy. But the self, the deeper soul, seeks more than that. It seeks integration. It seeks to become whole, not perfect. This means embracing complexity, ambiguity, contradiction. It means making peace with the parts of ourselves that we once tried to hide, with the experiences that shaped us even when they hurt. The desire for wholeness often brings a sense of quiet realism. A person no longer expects every day to be bright, every relationship to be easy, or every moment to feel good. But they begin to recognize that meaning can be found even in difficulty. Grief is no longer just something to endure. It becomes a portal to deeper love. Regret is no longer a burden, but a teacher. Vulnerability is no longer shameful, but necessary for connection. This is not resignation. It is ripening. It is the self finally accepting that life is not about being happy all the time. It is about being real all the time. As the longing for wholeness deepens, people often become more compassionate, both with others and themselves. They are less quick to judge and more able to listen. They no longer divide the world into good and bad, success and failure, strong and weak. They see that everyone carries wounds, everyone struggles, and everyone at their core is longing to be seen and accepted as they are. This awareness brings a kind of grace into daily life. Arguments become less important. Apologies come more easily. Forgiveness becomes not a favor, but a freedom. This shift also changes how a person sees their own story. They begin to look back not just for what went wrong or right, but for what it all meant. The painful chapters are no longer edited out. Instead, they are read with new eyes. That time of loss, it made the heart more open. That failure, it made the soul more humble. That loneliness, it called them inward. Everything belongs. Nothing is wasted. Wholeness, after all, is not found in purity or perfection. It is found in integration, bringing all parts of one's life into the circle, not to fix them, but to include them. In this way, the later years of life become a time of gathering. Not gathering possessions or accolades, but gathering truths. A person begins to reclaim lost parts of themselves, forgotten dreams, neglected joys, silenced emotions. They make space for the inner child who still wants to play, the inner elder who longs for wisdom, the inner shadow who holds wounds that were never named. And as these parts are welcomed, the person begins to feel whole. Not because life has been easy, but because they have said yes to all of it. This kind of wholeness brings a different kind of peace. It is not the peace of having no problems. It is the peace of no longer needing to run from them. It is not the happiness of having everything go right. It is the strength to remain grounded when things go wrong. It is not about always feeling light. It is about holding the light and the dark together in the same open hands. This peace does not come quickly. It is earned through years of living, struggling, loving, losing, and continuing. But when it comes, it is unmistakable. It is a quiet steadiness that does not depend on circumstances. It is an inner homecoming. Wholeness also shifts a person's focus from external goals to inner alignment. What matters now is not what others see, but what one feels inside. Integrity becomes more important than image. Presence becomes more important than performance. A person may begin to speak more truthfully, even when it is uncomfortable. They may begin to live more simply, even if others don't understand. They may make choices based on what resonates deeply, not what looks impressive. This is not about withdrawing from life. It is about inhabiting it more fully, more honestly, more completely. The journey to wholeness is not a straight line. There are setbacks, contradictions, unfinished business, but there is no rush. The soul moves in spirals, not steps. Each return to an old wound or pattern brings new insight, new healing, and slowly, the pieces come together, not perfectly, but authentically. The cracks are not hidden. They are embraced. They are what make the person real. They are what let the light in. In the end, the longing for happiness gives way to something deeper, the longing to be whole, to be at peace not because everything is good, but because everything has been welcomed. To look at one's life and say, not I did it right, but I lived it fully. That is the quiet triumph of later life. Not to chase happiness, but to find wholeness. Not to escape pain, but to be changed by it. Not to be perfect, but to be complete. And in that completeness, to find the kind of peace that cannot be taken away. The second half of life isn't about decline. It's about returning to your true self, to your soul, to the quiet truths that were always there, waiting. And if you've noticed these signs in your own life, maybe you're already walking that path. You're not lost, you're becoming. And the best part is, you're right on time.